I'm not trying to single out the Chinese government, although they are quite prolific in this regard. They are taking a generations long approach to steal as much information as they can about the United States and its citizens. They done things like the hack of the Office of Personnel Management in the mid 2010s, where they stole security clearance investigations for millions of people, including me, stole my biometrics, my fingerprints. They have.
Welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we explore how people, process, policy, and technology drive effective change. This is Dr. Darren, Chief Enterprise Architect, Educator, Author, and most importantly, your host.
In this episode, navigating the intersection of AI and cybersecurity, with AI cybersecurity expert Walter Haydon. Walter, welcome to the show.
Darren, thanks so much for having me on.
Hey, I'm really excited about this topic because it's an important topic. AI, who can't talk about AI nowadays? But cybersecurity specifically, I think it's a big gaping hole, something that can cause a lot of issues for us in the near future, or it's already happening. But before we dive into that, everyone knows on my show, I only have superheroes on the show, and every superhero has a background story. So Walter, what's your background story?
Well, Darren, thanks for that. So I'm the founder of StackAware, which is a company that helps others manage and measure cybersecurity, privacy, and compliance risk. But before that, I worked at a range of different organizations. I worked at a venture-backed startup. I worked at a relatively big publicly traded company focused on cybersecurity. Before that, I spent most of my career in the public sector. I worked on Capitol Hill as a staffer for the House Homeland Security Committee, focused on cybersecurity and counterterrorism issues. Before that, I worked in the intelligence community as a targeting officer at the National Counterterrorism Center. And that was while I was still active duty in the United States Marine Corps, where I was a ground intelligence and reconnaissance officer.
Well, first off, thank you for your service. And so you were in the thick of things, it sounds like, as far as security goes.
From every angle and perspective, yes.
So Walter, you've been in the thick of things the last 20 years. How have you seen any changes over that amount of time?
Absolutely. So one of my formative experiences from a cybersecurity perspective was reading a report from a company that is called Mandiant. They are now part of Google, but back then they were independent advisory and consultancy, and they put together a really fascinating report about the Chinese government's cyber espionage efforts. And that was more than a dozen years ago at this point. And that kind of laid out the size of the threat to the United States, to Western society when it comes to cybersecurity. And unfortunately, I don't think we've learned too much since that time. We've seen a lot of evolution in the threat, both from China, but also from individual criminal hackers, from mischief makers, from all sorts of different angles. And the threats have evolved quickly. I think companies have gotten better at understanding the risk and making informed decisions about it. But because the threat is changing so quickly and always on the move, it's very difficult to say we've solved the problem, and AI just throws a whole new wrench into the gears.
Yeah, I was gonna say AI must accelerate dramatically the different types of attacks that we can see in cybersecurity, especially from our adversaries, right? Are you seeing that already?
Artificial intelligence is definitely accelerating the pace of attacks from different angles, whether that's individual criminals. But interestingly, Anthropic released a paper a couple weeks ago, I think, about how probable Chinese intelligence services were using Claude, the AI model that Anthropic publishes, to accelerate some of their espionage campaigns. So we're seeing kind of the same general strategy, but the tactics are evolving to take advantage of new technologies.
So you said espionage. So that's different than a cyber attack, right? Where I'm actually going to maybe take down things. Because I don't know. The first thing that pops into my head on a cyber attack is I'm going to come in and not just steal things. That would be more espionage, right? But I'm actually going to cause harm, right, to infrastructure or things. I guess the reason I think that is because my dissertation was on critical infrastructure and the threat of cybersecurity in physical infrastructure or critical infrastructure. Um, do you see it moving in that direction, or do you think it's still spying, espionage type of thing, where I'm getting data instead of causing harm? Does that make any sense?
100%. So the outcome of the attack will depend a lot on the actor that is responsible. So the Chinese, especially, are laser like focused on intelligence collection, espionage, things like that. Rarely are they doing anything directly disruptive in the cyber domain. Now, that's a little different from, say, the Russians, which are both spying, but they're also doing disruptive activities, as we saw in the mid 2010s when they took information, stole it, and then released it against Ukraine. They've launched a series of cyber attacks against critical infrastructure like the electrical grid. And then there are kind of semi-state sponsored entities like ransomware gangs that often operate from Russia and satellite states that will do things like encrypt the control systems for the Colonial Pipeline, like happened in
Right. Yeah.
2021, causing direct impacts to daily life.
Right. So that's interesting. I never thought of it the two ways, because I always thought of it as an attack on bringing things down, because that's what I did all my research in. But the espionage thing, we don't really hear much about those attacks in the news and things, right? Because it's not impacting anyone directly. Indirectly, obviously, but directly, you rarely hear about it. Is that the reason why you think is because there's no impact to the public?
The impact from these massive data theft operations
Oh, I guess
is
those come out. Yeah.
what, but as you mentioned, are not immediately visible. Like if there's a ransomware attack against a piece of critical infrastructure where people are running out of gas in their cars, they notice
Yes.
that is
Or
happening for
electricity
sure.
shut off.
Right.
Right.
That's happening right now. I'm not trying to single out the Chinese government, although they are quite prolific in this regard. They are taking a generations long approach to steal as much information as they can about the United States and its citizens. They done things like the hack of the Office of Personnel Management in the mid 2010s, where they stole security clearance investigations for millions of people, including me, stole my biometrics, my fingerprints they have. And then in 2017, they attacked the credit bureau Equifax and stole hundreds of millions of records from Americans, looking at credit reports, finances, things like that. And they are trying to aggregate a massive data warehouse of information that, with artificial intelligence, they're going to be able to analyze more effectively and help guide their national security strategy in the decades to come.
Man, I never thought of that part of hacking, right? Of cybersecurity or cyber protection. Was all of our data is out there, and now our enemies have it. They can come up with strategies on how to, I don't know, undermine our economy, undermine our society, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can understand that states and governments are going to behave in their self-interest, and when you have a reservoir of technical talent like China does, and you have the need to, or the perceived need to, counter American influence or allies in the region. China has a history of feeling oppressed, or and that may be justified in some ways by its neighbors and by foreign powers. So I could definitely see it from a logical perspective why they're taking this approach. And their leaders operate with a very long-term perspective. They're not bound by
Patient.
4-year election cycles like we are.
Yeah.
Xi Jinping is president for life, so he's got a long horizon.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Okay, now that we sufficiently scared everybody, right? How does AI get in the throes of this? On processing the data, obviously. What about on the cybersecurity side? Is there some good news around AI and cybersecurity? Is it going to help us, or is it just helping the bad guys?
Yes, is the answer to your question. So to break it down a little more in depth, I'll say there are three main intersections between cybersecurity and AI. The first one is AI for cybersecurity. This means things like enhanced or autonomous security operations centers that are helping to identify incidents and block them in real time. The next intersection would be what I call AI for hacking. I consider hacking to be a neutral term. There can be criminal hackers, like, as I mentioned, Chinese intelligence services. There could also be ethical hackers who do penetration testing, who try to identify vulnerabilities in systems and then report them to the owners of those systems. And I work with many good ethical hackers. And using AI can accelerate things like vulnerability identification or exploit development to assist in those hacking efforts, whether they're ethical or not. And then the third space is security of AI. And that's primarily where I focus because artificial intelligence brings with it a whole range of its own inherent risks that can be related to unintended training on sensitive data. It could relate to unintended outputs or inaccurate results from AI systems. And then it also can lead to regulatory issues if you're not careful how you're deploying artificial intelligence systems and models.
So I've heard this before, that AI has kind of opened up new threat vectors that we didn't have before, primarily because the input to an AI is so open, right? I mean, before with computer systems, because I'm a software engineer, with computer systems, I could check input, right, very easily. I could check for boundaries. I could check for all these things that could help in alleviate any kind of cyber attack that was going on. But because AI is more open-ended in their interface, does that increase the threat vectors that we haven't had before, different ways of attacking AI that we haven't had before? Or is that just news fluff that's out there?
The non-deterministic, excuse me, the non-deterministic nature of artificial intelligence, which means, as you mentioned, that the inputs do not necessarily guarantee the outputs, definitely makes securing AI systems a novel problem. And I'll give you a specific example. So SQL injection, structured query language injection, has been something that's plagued information systems for a long time. Now, we've developed a set of best practices, input sanitization, parameterized queries, things like that, that can help you deal with SQL injection. And theoretically, if you apply every single control required, you could potentially defeat every SQL injection attack. That is not true with something like prompt injection or even jailbreaking of generative AI systems, because there are literally infinite attack vectors against a system like that. So there's no way to develop a control to address every possible input.
Well, that's got to be really hard for cybersecurity professionals because it's all about control. It's right. It really is, right? Especially all the software standards that came out around cybersecurity best practices. It was all about controlling the backend systems from the interface that you're exposing. Now I've kind of lost control. Or are there ways I can still have control?
Unfortunately, cybersecurity professionals are going to have to give up the sense of having perfect control over their environments because AI systems operate in a non-deterministic way. Now, with that said, there's another type of asset that has always operated in a non-deterministic way, and that's a human.
I was going to
Humans
say humans,
operate
right?
in unpredictable ways. And if you look at things like insider threat risk management, if you look at even phishing, accidental cybersecurity incidents like that, you'll see that humans have historically behaved in unpredictable ways in the local sense, but over a broad sense, you can predict over time how many people are going to fall for a phishing attack, how many people are going to try to steal trade secrets from an organization. So taking a probabilistic approach to cybersecurity and risk management, which is something that's always made sense, is critical now with the widespread use of AI systems.
So the people that were already doing probabilistic because of cost, right? We all know if I had unlimited funds, my cybersecurity would be even greater, right? But because of the non-deterministic areas that we're dealing with now, even more so, I need to focus more on those I can't even speak, probabilistic methodologies that other organizations have already been using that maybe have a tighter budget, or maybe I don't know. Maybe they don't want something perfectly secure because it just costs too much in time and resources.
If you want a system that's perfectly secure, then you should probably just shut it down, disconnect it from the internet, encase it in concrete, and drop it in the middle of the ocean. In that case, it'll be perfectly secure, but it won't do anything. So if you don't want to go there, then what I recommend is using a quantitative approach to risk management, where you look at the likelihood of an event occurring. You look at the impact if it does occur, and then you can come up with a financial cost that you expect to suffer over time. And then compare that to the cost of controls to address the risk or to bring it down. And then also look at how much money you're making from the business process in question, or the value you're providing to your customers or to patients or to other stakeholders. And that allows you to make an informed decision about whether it makes sense or not to deploy the system as is.
So do you feel that adopting AI into your organization increases the cost then of securing the system? Or you know what I mean? It throws a new wrench into those probability and quantitative measures that you're talking about. Is the cost, the risk too high?
The question of
You see
whether
what I'm saying?
the risk justifies the reward is key. And it isn't always clear, but there are tools that you can use to make informed decisions. I'll give an example of healthcare. That's a high risk, high reward area for deployment of artificial intelligence systems. So on the risk side, you've got protected health information that you need to take care of. You need to make sure that you're giving people accurate recommendations, diagnoses. But on the reward side of things, I mean, in the United States, we spend the most per capita on healthcare in the world, but we have pretty poor outcomes. So we need to do something better. We need to improve something. And I think there's a lot of money spent on the administrative side of things where artificial intelligence can help. So that's a scenario where the risk is high, the reward is high, and then doing a quantitative analysis will tell you whether it makes sense to proceed with a deployment or not.
No, all right, that makes sense. So let's say that I've got a company, right? And I've decided to adopt AI. I'm adopting AI. You're going to consult with me. How do I secure things better now than what I already have? And let's say that I'm kind of mid-tier in my practices. I train my staff on phishing attacks because we all know phishing attacks, number one way into my systems. I have people rotate passwords. I have multi-factor authentication. So some basic fundamental things I'm already doing. I haven't had any infiltration in a long time that I know about. That's another thing, right? Um, All right, now I'm going to adopt AI. What do I do now? How does that change my security position?
The first three things I would recommend to an organization that is deploying artificial intelligence are things that would apply to normal information technology systems, but they bear repeating specifically in the case of AI. So, first of all, have a policy in place that says what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, even going as far to say which systems are approved for use for which data classifications. That's something that can help a lot. Now, once you have that policy in place, then you can go in and do an asset inventory, identify all the systems and models that you're using. You may want to say, hey, we have an amnesty period where if you were using something that maybe wasn't on the list, you've got until this date to report it because we just want to know, we want to understand what our exposure's been. And then when you have those things established, you've got a risk appetite set through the policy, and then you understand what assets you're using through the inventory. Then you can do a comprehensive risk assessment and determine matching against your policy, saying, hey, these ways of using AI are acceptable and these are not acceptable. And then you can enforce those rules once you have made those decisions.
Okay, I like that approach. That's a very practical approach. All right. Are there any tools that can help me, especially with the models? How do I know that a model is secure, that it's not, that it doesn't have malicious, or I don't know what the right word is, right? That it's not going to tell me to do something that's going to open up things to be more prone to cyber attack. How do I secure the AI itself?
Yeah, so great question regarding model security and provenance. A key thing to look at when you're evaluating an AI system is the provenance of the data on which the model was trained. So there are many reasons for this. One, you want to have accurate outputs. You want to have outputs that meet your business requirements, that don't offend your customers. And then going back to the China discussion we had earlier in the conversation, if you look at DeepSeek, for example, that model has both embedded into the training data itself and also in the system prompt a series of instructions that clearly tell it to avoid certain topics that are offensive to the Chinese Communist Party, like talking about the Tiananmen Square massacre or talking about the Uyghur ethnic minority in China. So understanding the motivations of the developer of a model is equally important as is the technical verification of it.
Well, where can I find that sort of information? Especially if I'm like, let's say I'm going to use a public Gen AI, right? For my small business, a public Gen AI is all I know how to use, right? I'm going to maybe use their interface and things. How do I know? Um, there's no place I can go to see that information that you're talking about. How was it trained? What are their biases? How do I figure that out? I feel lost. You know what I mean?
There's definitely an issue with respect to opacity when it comes to the proprietary generative AI models out there. OpenAI, Anthropic, even Google Gemini say very little about the data on which these models were trained. Now, they do provide some information in the form of model cards, which can be helpful in determining the relative risks. So, OpenAI recently published GPT 5.2, and they mentioned that there were some regressions in certain categories when it came to deceptiveness, for example, in the model compared to GPT 5.1. So you can use those types of benchmarks to make relative security calls. With that said, as you allude to, we don't have a full inventory of all the data on which these models were trained or the processes by which they were trained, because those are trade secrets to those
Right.
companies.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
to a degree, you're going to need to trust their representations and then verify the models in production, see how they behave in the real world.
Okay. So that's the same for, would you say that's the same for the private models too, that, or I should say private, the open models that I can run my own private Gen AI? I don't have that kind of information either, or is there more information on the open source models that are out there? And can I trust those more?
Whether or not you decide to use an open source model depends on a variety of things. It's definitely more transparent. You can see the code of the model that you're using. You don't necessarily see the training data because you can get the model without getting the training data. So there is some opacity there, but you can see the inputs and the outputs and things like that. You can inspect the model for backdoors, see if there's any callbacks, things like that. Now, on the other hand, by deploying an open source model in your own infrastructure, you're going to assume some of the risk of securing that infrastructure. And misconfiguration is a huge security risk, especially when you're talking about infrastructure as a service. Making the wrong settings on your deployment is a risk to be considered. And then also, how are you going to maintain that from a business perspective? So these are all considerations that organizations should take into account. And it depends on what your requirements are, whether it makes sense to use a proprietary third-party service like OpenAI or Anthropic, or if you want to run an open source model on your own infrastructure.
All right. So it sounds to me like the security concerns are not identical, but very similar between running a public gen AI and a private one. The private one, obviously, you have to secure your infrastructure. And is there anything unique about securing that infrastructure over running an application that you've downloaded or purchased anyway? I'm guessing that the security constraints are probably very similar there as well, right? Or is there something unique about these models and how they're hosted that have to do something a little extra or special?
When you're deploying an open source AI model, the general security considerations are the same as if you're deploying any sort of app. However, there are some wrinkles in there in that there are a lot of malicious packages out there that are specifically targeting AI developers to try to trick them into downloading this malicious code into their environments. So that's definitely one risk to take into account. And the proprietary AI developers also need to face this risk, but they have more elaborate security teams. They have policies, procedures in place to make these checks. So be aware of what packages and models you're using, because just because it's out there publicly available for free doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe and secure.
That it's safe, yeah. Do they rate these or verify these? Is there like I hate to call it a certification or a verification cert that I can, out there on Hugging Face? Everyone knows Hugging Face is where all the models are now. I mean, that's it. How do I know that I'm getting a good model from Hugging Face that doesn't have malicious code in there? Is there a special way to figure that out, or is there another website I can go to that say, hey, these are the safe models?
Hugging Face does have some security checks in place to
Okay.
mitigate the risk of malicious packages, but it's not fail-safe. And there have been security researchers and malicious actors who have successfully inserted hijacked or poisoned models into Hugging Face. So that's not a fail-safe. One thing to look at, you mentioned certification, is this is at a much higher level and it doesn't apply to specific models, but looking at vendors and organizations, you can look at ISO 42001 as a standard to determine whether or not an organization has had certification of its artificial intelligence management system. I know Anthropic, for example, has undergone that type of certification for some of its products. OpenAI has not. And that's a potential way that you can do your diligence on an artificial intelligence vendor.
Okay, so this is a new standard, obviously, that's come out recently. ISO, you said 42001.
42001, yep.
So, and of all the big boys so far, just Anthropic has been the only one that's gone through that certification, or are there others that have gone through that? Do you know?
Amazon Web Services has had several products included in the scope of its ISO 42001 certification. Microsoft has had its Azure AI Foundry. I believe that is the current name for it. Of every company, Microsoft changes its product names
Of
faster than
course.
anyone else. So they have undergone that certification. So it is expanding in terms of applicability and how many companies are pursuing it.
Got it. But just because you get that doesn't mean that you are secure. It just means that you've put together some processes to move in that direction, right?
That's right. So ISO 42001, like most compliance standards, basically lays out a roadmap for how to build a risk management program. And then the external certification is someone auditing you and confirming that you are following those rules of the road and your own requirements. It's not necessarily guaranteeing that you are, quote, secure, unquote, or that you're
Right.
not going to have any sort of
Yeah,
incident.
just like any other any other
Right.
standards thing that's out there. All right, so what can I do? Right? It sounds like maybe it's not worth doing AI because it just seems like there's so many moving parts here. Is there anything I can do once I have some models set up that I can protect my data? I can protect my infrastructure. Are there any new tools out there that help with managing these AI systems? Because there's a lot more out there. It seems like once I add AI into the mix, there's a lot more going on. Is there any help out there for me, Walter?
Well, definitely that's what StackAware does, is help our customers measure and manage the risk. But short of that, there are certainly controls you can put in place, like, for example, looking at the training policies of the vendors and services that you're using. So making sure that you're not accidentally exposing your sensitive data to a model that could be exposed to someone else. You can also apply things like rate limiting to queries to AI systems to make sure that you're not exhausting resources, or people can't rack up huge bills on your behalf if you've built chatbots that are exposed externally. And then also, doing integrity checks on the outputs, making sure that they meet your business requirements, at least within a range of values, to ensure that you're not, putting out garbage from your AI systems is a key control.
Oh, well, these are all really great things. So, Walter, if people want to find out more about Stackware and what you guys do and how to engage with you, because there's so much information. I feel like my audience is going to go like, I need to talk to Walter. How do they reach out to you, Walter?
Yeah, the best way to get in touch would be find me on LinkedIn. I post there every day, so give me a follow for tips on AI governance and security. And if you're interested, send me a direct message or head to stackware.com to book a call.
Hey, Walter, it's been great having you on the show today. I learned so much. I'm a little more scared than I was before, that I need to do a better job on my AI projects that I've been working on to kind of lock them down a little bit more. I've been probably free-willing it like everybody else in AI, right? Oh, it's so much fun. Let's just, no one's gonna hurt me, right? Type of thing. So I got some things to do. And I will fix them before I release this episode, obviously. But thanks for coming on today. This has been very informative.
Well, thank you, Darren. I appreciate the time. And please let me know if I can be helpful to you going forward, and look forward to seeing the show go out.
Thanks for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation. If you enjoyed today's conversation, give us 5 stars on your favorite podcasting app or on YouTube. It really helps others discover the show. If you want to go deeper, join our exclusive community at patreon.com/embracingdigital, where we share bonus content and you can always connect with other change makers like yourself. You can always find more resources at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, keep embracing the digital transformation.